basis, and I detail that in the book. So they did that. As you see, he did my title today is "Can the UN or government or a carbon tax basically control the temperature of weather?" Because ultimately, politically, that's where we are with the climate debate. My book, which I believe you read at least one of the chapters, The Politically Incorrect Guide, I go through a whole series of all the different issues, the whole history of it. I go through what's happening with children today in terms of indoctrination and the fear factor that's being used. Also, just the absurd claims. And if I was advising from a communication point, the climate movement, I would have a lot of advice, because you just shoot yourself in the foot. The UN report is actually the latest example, coming up with another tipping point after all these other just ridiculously comical tipping points. Prince Charles, 100 months, the UN in 1989, a 10-year tipping point, the UN in 1982. And just, IPCC chairman, officials, people like Michael Mann, UN scientists, just constantly drawing lines in the sand and passing it. I've been called an a-hole on live BBC TV. You guys might want to call me that after today, I'm not sure. This is a poster of me being wanted as a climate criminal. I think go to the next one there. Okay.
So this is this is your book.
This was at the premiere of my film in Paris during the UN Paris Climate Summit. We actually had a packed, sold-out theater, and it almost had to be shut down because of all the protesters. But the day of, they had a wanted for being a climate criminal. And one of the things I'd recommend is you go through the book and read some of the scientists' stories. If this were purely a scientific issue, there would not be the thrust to shut down dissent. And scientists talk about if they don't toe the line, their careers are ruined, threatened. One of my favorites is Joanne Simpson. She was the first woman PhD meteorologist, worked for NASA. I think she was the first one in America. And she waited till she was almost 80 years old, and her quote was, now that I'm retired, I can say it, I'm a skeptic. That's the kind of pressure. A woman who overcame that, PhD meteorologist, worked for NASA for years, and then didn't feel comfortable saying she was a skeptic till after she retired. All right, next panel. So the point where I'll try to make, and I think I read in the book, and I'm not going to spend a lot of time on science in terms of trying to convince you. I'm just going to lay out a quick case, and I want to get to some of the more absurd examples of why I think you guys are losing the climate debate. I'm happy to say here, I'm in Washington, D.C. I'm actually only 2 blocks from the White House. The latest UN climate report is dead on arrival because of Donald Trump's administration, and that is so refreshing to see. Much better than any other Republican president done in terms of Mitt Romney, John McCain, George W. Bush. You can have them all. Donald Trump, I think, actually understands the science, so you can sticker if you want. CO2 is not the control knob of climate. Let's go to the next one. Yes, I would expect them to snicker. Okay, the next panel is the climate change. I think this is the simplified way. Again, you guys aren't taking the simplified way because I assume you're science students here. But climate change is governed by hundreds of factors or variables. The idea that we can just say, carbon dioxide, we need a temperature goal that's pulled out of thin air, 1.5 degrees. We need a carbon tax. We need EPA regulations. And then we'll have less storminess. We had the specter, the idiocy, if you will, of Democrat Senator Chuck Schumer just last week on the U.S. Senate floor saying if we had acted sooner, our hurricanes would be a lot less. They actually believe that we can legislate the intensity and frequency of hurricanes. And honestly, your professor, Dessler, should be a sort of a truth squad and try to control some of these politicians on his side, meaning the ones trying to call for climate action. He should try to rein them in sometimes because they make really idiotic statements. Another one is an Obama administration official said we need the EPA climate regulations because they will we've had such bad storms, implying that we'll have less storms if we pass EPA regulations, despite the fact that 2 of Obama's EPA administrators admitted not only would it not impact storms, it wouldn't even impact global CO2 levels, thus it wouldn't even impact temperature. So it's all essentially symbolism, but they act as though they can actually have real impacts. In the book chapter, in the Skeptical Scientist, that geologically speaking, Earth is in a CO2 famine. Here I'm quoting Princeton physicist Will Happer. The geologic record shows we've had ice ages with much higher CO2, and we've had temperatures similar with up to 20 times level CO2. Now you could say, oh, there was a dim sun, there was different atmospheric conditions, but if you look through, you cannot find anywhere that shows that CO2 is the control knob of the climate. That's what skeptical scientists, Dr. Patrick Moore, we had higher temperatures, CO2 was much higher today, with higher and lower temperatures. This chart is briefly in the movie. I just thought I'd show it to you. This was actually by Leighton Stewart, a geologist, modifying one of the original. You see Gore's high point at the end. That was his scary high point that he got up in the conveyor belt in his 2006 Inconvenient Truth. And that's what he said, this is where we've been. And if you just look at the geologic history of the Earth, going back, that's almost over 500 million years, you will see that CO2 has been much, much higher. As Robert Giegengak, who's featured in the film, says, this is a 90% of the Earth's history, carbon dioxide has been much higher than currently, and actually 90% of the Earth's history, the Earth has been much warmer. In other words, we're in the 10% warmest period where we actually have ice on both poles. It can support that. All right, extreme weather. This next slide, please. Okay. Floods are not increasing, flood disasters, droughts not getting worse. And actually the new UN report, as much as the UN wanted to lobby and scare everyone, they quietly admitted that there's low confidence or no confidence that storms aren't getting worse. That's pretty significant for them to concede that. It wasn't highlighted. But on all metrics of extreme weather, right, the next one, whether you're talking wildfires, much worse in previous centuries. This was some of the wildfire experts, forestry professors that have testified in the Senate. Much bigger fires common before 1940, and wildfires aren't even a good measure of climate because it deals with so much with land use, water resources, and construction development. It's not as easy to look at it from a climate. All right, next one. Just another example of wildfires, total acreage burned. Next, I'll go a little faster. Flood damage. This is Roger Pilkey Jr., who's not even really a climate denier, but he gets treated as one because he likes to point out the inconvenient facts, particularly on extreme weather. The next one. Average drought conditions, again, showing either no trend, declining trend, and this includes the California drought that everyone was all upset about. California had much worse droughts in previous centuries before we had high CO2. Inverse correlation, the next one is a hurricane. This is a little bit, I guess you would say, you might get some snickers in the audience, having a little bit of fun, but just showing you that the landfalling U.S. hurricanes versus CO2, more CO2 has actually resulted in less landfalling hurricanes. And that's actually true in Florida as a whole, and Category 3 and smaller hurricanes. It's pretty amazing to look at it. I'm not actually arguing that more CO2 is causing less hurricanes. This is more of a silly chart for discussion just to prove a point that as CO2's gone up, the hurricanes have not. All right, next one. This is Dr. Ryan Mao. This was updated as of earlier this year, so it's probably changed a little with the recent hurricanes, but you can just see the trend is not going up, even in recent years, let alone 5100. This is just since 1980. Go to the next one, tornadoes. This could be updated 2015, but actually we've had record low tornadoes in previous years. So whatever you think, when people like Michael Mann come out and say, if you want to know what climate change is doing, just look outside your window. Wrong. A 4.5 billion-year-old Earth, and you're going to get your little time on Earth, look out a window and think you understand climate change. And even if you go by the last few decades, the science doesn't support it. Next. Sea level rise. Now, in my book, I didn't read this chapter, but I have a whole thing about dueling data sets. If you use the satellites in 1993, you can show an acceleration. If you use tide gauges, you don't show an acceleration. All depends on the year in which you want to start, or the time frame you want to start using it. They also have different adjustments they make. But generally, sea levels not. One of my favorite quotes is Dr. Robert Giegengak, who says, if sea levels are rising due to global warming, nobody's told sea level, because it's not cooperating with those predictions. And if you believe it is, and you're all excited about the UN report, and you want everyone to act, and you want to, electric cars and solar and wind, this is a great quote. This is Heinrich Tennekes from the Meteorological Institute in Denmark. He actually says, I protest vigorously the idea that climate reacts like a home heating system to changing a setting on your thermometer. Turn the dial and the desired temperature will be reached. This is one of the biggest ways you lose the vast majority of Americans. They don't buy that we face a climate crisis, number one, and number two, that government can come in and tax and regulate the climate and we can get the climate we want or prevent the bad climate we don't want. Until you can actually make a point and make that make sense, you're literally preaching medieval witchcraft to people. Now, I'll pause for Snickers. Snicker. Okay. Next one, polar bears. Okay. Polar bears are no longer an icon. If you saw Al Gore's sequel, not mentioned. Al Gore's book, not mentioned. Why? Why has the environmental groups dropped the polar bear? They are at or near historic population highs right now. They're actually fat, healthy polar bears. They've abandoned the use. This is Susan Crockford, a zoologist who's studying now polar bears and doing studies on them. And there's many other polar bear experts I cite in the book, but they literally have been dropped because there's so many of them. Other than a few like weird examples where they find a starving polar bear, National Geographic had to apologize for trying to claim that one starving polar bear meant climate change. All right, next. In terms of sea level, the study, this will be a new study, I believe, either later this year or next year. Jay Zwally of NASA showing that sea level Antarctica is contributing to a sea level rise lowering. And we've heard all this alarm before. Greenland's melting. This is an article, 1939. Go to the next one. I'm trying to go fast here. So.
Don't rush your.
Okay, slow down. Okay.
We're doing fine on time.
We've never seen this before.
Don't feel.
And I have whole chapters in the book of this. But here's 1939. Greenland glaciers are melting. In 1864, by the way, we had an MIT professor warning of climatic excess unless we acted immediately because we were destroying the environment. All right, the next one. UN lead author. This is important. I have a whole chapter in the book about UN scientists who have turned against the UN. And one of them is Richard Toll. He's a lead author of the IPCC. He said the idea that climate change poses an existential threat is laughable. He said global warming has become a religion. And in the book, I detail Richard Toll and many other UN scientists who've either resigned, quit in disgust, and they talk about how the UN scientists say, we'll make the next report so alarming, the world will have to act. The latest UN report was only 91 scientists. And the media went to Michael Oppenheimer, their go-to guy, who is an environmental defense fund, environmental activist. He also got $250,000 from Barbara Streisand. So for those of you who talk about the big evil oil industry influence and you discount any skeptic because you assume they have oil funding, first of all, ExxonMobil gave Stanford University over $100 million to study global warming because the big corporations and oil companies want to appear green. So they've been lavishing out money. The fracking industry, natural gas, gave Sierra Club, I think the number is either 24, 27 million to fight coal. That's more than the combined budgets of the three biggest skeptical groups, as I detail in the book. So if you're worried about oil funding, take a look at Al Gore, and Al Jazeera bought out his network. Al Gore is the largest oil-funded player in the climate debate today. Look at where the oil funding is going in the fossil fuel before you ever accuse a skeptic of being oil-funded. But Richard Toll and other UN scientists go through and just talk about its ideology. It's a faith-based. I mean, the head of the UN climate panel was Rajendra Pachauri. He actually said the day he resigned, global warming is my religion. This is the guy leading the alleged science panel of the United Nations, the Intergovernmental Panel on Science. Are you guys even aware of this stuff, or you just take it on faith? Because if you are, it's hard to believe you'll be dutiful, obedient academics. I want you to question authority. This is the 1960s all over again. We need that spirit of questioning authority. Okay, next panel, global warming causing terrorism. Before global warming caused terrorism, global cooling caused terrorism. This is from the 1974 CIA report, warning of all the same things we hear about global warming today. Oh, it's going to bring drought, famine, political unrest. We must do something. We must act. I have a whole bonus chapter on the book all about the peer-reviewed science showing that there is no link to national security. In fact, cooler times coincide with war. So if you're worried about political instability, we need a carbon tax to prevent it, actually do the research and look at the peer-reviewed literature. Next one, and this is 1974. For those of you, and I know there were several studies claiming that the global cooling in the 1970s never happened. It didn't exist. It's been erased. We had many people claiming this a few years back. In 1974, there were 60 theories to explain global cooling. And I go through all the details. I show all the media outlets. I show the NASA scientists, the CIA reports. Colleagues of Dr. James Hansen, who later led NASA, were actually doing studies. People like Stephen Schneider were involved, thinking that the aerosols were going to essentially block out the sun, dim the earth, cause global cooling. It's fine if you can say skeptics overblown the 1970s global cooling scare. It's possible we may have a little fun exaggerating it, but you can't erase it and go the other direction. And so I spent a lot of time in the book documenting the 1970s global cooling scare because history is important. And what's most important about that is the same dumb claims are repeated. Tipping points, bad weather, instability. Just realize everything you think is new and unique to global warming, Paul Ehrlich did it with the overpopulation scare. One of the things I point out in the book is whether you're talking overpopulation, the resource scarcity, global cooling, other environmental degradations, it's always the same solution regardless of the problem. Central planning, less national sovereignty, essentially either eliminating capitalism or severely curtailing and regulating it. Despite the fact that capitalism, which in its technology has been one of the greatest liberators of mankind and the environment. Today, the more wealth and economic growth in the poor countries, the cleaner water, cleaner air, cleaner health of the people, and the actual plants and animals do better because they're not slashing and burning the agriculture. So that's 1974. So there we go to the next one. Truth about the UN climate panel. Now, this group was set up in 1988, and it's called, I think Seth Borenstein of the Associated Press loves to say, the Nobel Prize-winning United Nations Climate Panel. Ooh, sounds like they won a pretty important scientific award. Wrong. As you should know, they won a peace prize, a Nobel Peace Prize for what? Political activism. And a previous Nobel Prize winner who actually endorsed my book, Dr. Ivar Giæver, actually said he's ashamed of the Norwegian government for giving that Nobel Peace Prize to Al Gore and IPCC. Why? Because in 1988, they were formed to look at how global warming, CO2 drives global warming. If the UN panel fails to find global warming as the issue, suddenly they fail to have a reason to exist. And also, as an added bonus, the more they scare people, the more they appoint themselves in charge of the solutions. $100 billion UN climate fund. I interviewed South African development activists who tell me that the money is going to go to governments who are best able to keep their people locked in poverty. Why? Because they're the ones that are living most earth-friendly. So this UN money is going to go to governments that are going to be used by the politicians to get re-election, and they're going to keep economic development down. How do we know this? I've already been to, I go to every single UN climate summit. I'm going to the next one in Poland in December. And there are proposals there for planned recessions to fight global warming, for economic degrowth. So they're going to do this to the developing world. And I have a whole chapter in the book about how they're just laying waste to the developing world by not allowing them to have the same fossil fuel energy that we've had in America and in Europe and in the developed world. Okay, next one. This is an EU climate commissioner. She's former EU climate commissioner. They don't really care about the science. We were wrong. It's not climate. They want to do the policies that they want to do, to which I have a simple answer. Great. Stop coming up with tipping points. Stop making claims that this legislation or these UN treaties will alter the weather in any discernible way, and actually argue the merits of your energy policy by not using the fear. And that's something they have not been able to do. This latest UN report does it again. All right, next one. You say, oh, the climate panel, I'm being too hard. Their own words, UN IPCC Edenhofer said, we redistribute the world's wealth by climate policy. And this is my favorite. One has to free oneself from the illusion that the climate policy is environmental policy. It has almost nothing to do with it. In other words, I interviewed Cristina Figueres, the former UN climate chief. She said once that we seek a centralized transformation that will make life on planet Earth very different. That's what we're dealing with here. The American people know it. If this report, and I will say it again, is dead on arrival, and thank God it is, it should be just kicked into the dustbin of history. It's the same nonsense recycled over and over. When current reality fails to alarm, they end up just making scarier and scarier predictions of the future. This is what it's actually about. And the UN actually says we need fundamental changes in all aspects. There's an exact quote from this new UN report, which is what they're seeking, a political goal. All right, next. And I'll do this quickly, so go fast with me if you can here. This is some of the absurdity. You say, well, they've been right about all these climate predictions. The models have predicted it. Okay, let's see what they've been right. This is 2000. Climate change means less snow. Snow is a thing of the past. Go to the next one. Except when we have record snow, which we've had the East Coast, the snowiest decade on record. Guess what? Suddenly, climate change means more snow. They have studies predicting both ways. Climate change means the days are getting longer. The Earth's rotation is slowing down. Then you go to previously, global warming makes the Earth spin faster. It will reduce the length of a day. Guess what? Whatever happens, they're going to say, we predicted it. Our models, our studies predicted it. We were right. If you bet on both teams to win the Super Bowl, guess what? You're going to declare yourself a winner no matter what. That's what our climate debate has devolved into. And Professor Dessler should try to clean up his own side's climate climate science. That's what I'd recommend. Okay, climate change, let's go fast. Climate change makes wet places wetter, dry places drier, except when it makes wet places drier. The next one. And dry places wetter. This is just how they literally get any weather event and they just torture themselves to explain it. All right, now we're on Antarctica. Climate change causes Antarctica to lose land ice. Then the next one. Climate change causes Antarctica to gain land ice. And these are media headlines because they're easy to read, but these are all based on peer-reviewed studies that come out a few years apart. The next one, climate change makes for saltier seas. The seas are more salty. Next one, global warming makes seas less salty. So guess what? No matter what happens, they're going to be able to say they predicted it. Next one, climate change increases the spread of malaria. Let's go to the next one. It decreases the spread of malaria. Again, all based on peer-reviewed studies that the media is reporting on. Dengue outbreaks could increase with climate change is the next one, 2015. Then 2016, climate change could decrease dengue. Warmer climate could lower it. Which is it? Hey, we'll see what happens, and then we'll say, we predicted it. They're always right. This is the problem. And I go on and on in the book with this, dozens and dozens of key examples. New ones include global warming causes more lightning, less lightning. Today, the New York Times has an absurd article about a moose that has, I think, 100,000 ticks on it. And they actually studied moose for 3 years, and they're claiming the change in ticks is evidence of climate change. This is as silly as using the old armadillo from Texas and Oklahoma as a armadillo was migrating south to escape global cooling. The media jumped all over it, and studies did. Now, guess what? The same media and studies are claiming the armadillo is migrating north because it's getting too hot. It's called cyclical climate change, and it's just silly to sit there and make these claims. But climate change causes less rain. Are we there? Okay. The next one, climate change causes more rain, hey, but less water. So guess what? No matter what, just recently, Hurricane Harvey, climate change caused Hurricane Harvey to slow down. Then we have the most recent Hurricane Michael, and that was very fast moving. So why didn't climate change cause that to go fast moving? Well, it didn't do that, but it caused it to have much more precipitation and, and stronger winds. Whatever happens, they come up with explanations after the fact, and that's what drives hurricane experts crazy, particularly. Next one. Climate change causes more hurricanes, and next, except when it causes less hurricanes. Kerry Emanuel and other hurricane experts have been on both sides of this. Now they say it causes less but more intense hurricanes. Whatever happens, they're going to keep modifying it. Don't believe what they say now. And I'm not necessarily saying they're doing it in bad faith. They're so committed to their scientific theory that they're going to do whatever they have to keep it alive. And they're so threatened when anyone challenges it. Talk to people like Roger Pilkey Jr. Talk to people who I detail in the book who are just literally their careers are threatened. And Roger Pilkey Jr. left climate research because he couldn't handle all the brutality he got from just pointing out these simple facts. Okay, here's where we get a little more absurd. Los Angeles Times, based on peer-reviewed studies. These are done by IPCC scientists. Global warming causes more crime. All right, next. Climate change will become one of the major driving forces as a century progresses. This is where we are. Okay, so climate change causes more crime. But wait, are you ready for this? The New York Times says lowering crime causes global warming. If you have lower crime, it causes global warming. How is that possible? I thought global warming caused more crime. Let's take a look. Inmates consume less than the average citizen. So guess what? The more people we can lock up and live in a very primitive subsistence lifestyle in prison, that's better for the environment. So in a way, if global warming causes more crime, that's good because we'll end up with more people in prison, and then that'll reduce the global warming that caused it. So it's a self-solving problem. Next. Okay, so global warming causes more crime. Reducing crime causes more global warming. Now next. If you disagree with any of this, you're a climate denier, you belong in jail. Well, okay, now I'm being silly, right? Well, let's take a look. Bill Nye, the science guy, entertains the idea of jailing skeptics. And if you saw the movie, you saw Robert F. Kennedy Jr., CEO, others because of that. We have CNN today, Jeffrey Sachs, who I'm going to just say it. I hope I don't offend you, Andrew Dessler. You probably know that Jeffrey Sachs, UN advisor, Columbia University, is a nut. He's an advisor to Pope Francis. He says Donald Trump should be tried for crimes against humanity, that Trump and the Republicans have blood on their hands for not doing climate mitigation and all these different regulations and staying in the UN Paris Agreement. Blood on their hands. This is what the science you're studying is leading to. So you got to look at it and say something is rotten here. And it's the politics is rotten, but the core of this is the science. It's become a campaign cause that no one is allowed to challenge or dissent. ClimateGate emails, I show that the top UN scientists colluded to keep out studies in the peer-reviewed literature. They threatened journal editors, and I detail all that in the book. It'll be an eye-opener if you actually believe the absolute crap coming from the United Nations Climate Panel and much of academia. Here's a quote. Even if we face the climate crisis that Al Gore and Professor Dessler thinks, Robert Giegegak, geology fieldwork, peer-reviewed studies, none of the strategies offered by the U.S. government, EPA, or anybody else, including the United Nations, have the remotest chance of altering the climate if, in fact, the climate is controlled by carbon dioxide. And that's the key. We're just, as one scientist said, spitting in the wind. And this is where, you know, I had another scientist, Will Happer, actually say he's from Princeton, so he has some Harvard animosity. He said, if you go back, not much has changed. During the Salem witch trials, all the judges were educated at Harvard, or almost all of them were. And they condemned women to death for crop failure and for changing the weather. We really have not advanced that far when today on CNN website, we have a guy saying that Donald Trump should be tried for crimes against humanity and he has blood on his hands for not staying in the UN Paris Agreement. That's insane, okay? That's unscientific. That's anti-science. Professor Dessler should be condemning such absolute nonsense. Can I curse? I feel like cursing right now, but anyway. Okay, CO2 is not the villain as it's portrayed. The climate now is very close to the coldest. This is just a quote from, again, these are experts who aren't involved with the UN. He also said one great quote from Giegegak, which I include in the book, 97% of scientists, and the people have studied it. One study wasn't even 97 scientists, it was 77. It was a joke, and many of the skeptical scientists would agree. So based on 77 scientists, anonymous, by the way, they say we have a 97% consensus. Another one, the John Cook, Richard Toll looked into it and said it was pulled from thin air. None of the numbers in the study match up. Robert Giegegak said he trusts economists more than scientists. Why? Because you get hundreds of economists in a room, they're all going to disagree. He said, but somehow you get all these scientists that are selected by the UN or handpicked or self-select to join the UN, and they all agree. And by the way, the latest report was 91 scientists, and I have a whole report at Climate Depot on all their activist backgrounds and how they're not these neutral scientists that you might think they are. But you suddenly put all these scientists together and you have this 100 or 97%. And he says that's why he doesn't trust these climate scientists when they do that. Something else is afoot, and it's called a lobbying campaign. So with that, I don't know how much time we have left. I'd like to take any questions you have. I enjoy this. I just implore you to challenge authority. You can go to the last panel now. It has my email and all that on it. But you can challenge the existing authority, challenge the consensus. You young students are our hope. Unfortunately, you've been indoctrinated. I have a whole chapter. If you want to know why you believe the way you do, most likely, read my chapter on indoctrination of children. And it's much worse for younger kids today. It's appalling, the fear factor. We have kids now, there are claims where they need psychiatric medicine and counseling because they have the fear of climate doom. All nonsense. So the greatest thing, again, I just say again, UN report, dead on arrival, written by 91 activist scientists. And by the way, the recent U.S. government report, one of my analysis, it was really funny, because scientists, one of them was Catherine Hayhoe and others, Union of Concerned Scientists were involved. These are activist environmental groups that work with the federal government. These reports sound like they're written by Greenpeace, the U.S. federal government reports. It's because they usually are written by activists. And I point into great detail of that in the book. One of the things, National Academy of Science, it's virtually 100% dependent on government funding. You think, well, how could all those scientists, agree? Morano is just a crackpot. Again, I'll wait for snickering. But here's the thing. If they go against it, first of all, they don't poll rank and file members. And in the book, I go through a lot of the American Geophysical Union, other scientific bodies, American Geological Society. For the actual rank and file members are opposed to these climate statements. And all they are, the climate statements where they all agree, 2,000 governing board members, all these groups steeped in politics, in funding. In the case of the NAS, 100% government funding, state, local. So they have to toe the line. As Richard Lindzen once said, if government is paying these scientists to say we face a climate crisis, by golly, they're going to follow suit and say we face it. Now, again, that's not to say that they're going to corrupt this exactly, but they're going to self-select. They're going to choose their words carefully, and a lot of them are just such deep believers, the people like Michael Mann, the Michael Oppenheimers, that they'll go through it. One last note, if you think NASA's not been corrupted, Gavin Schmidt is running NASA. Gavin Schmidt has openly called for a carbon tax. Gavin Schmidt is a climate activist, started realclimate.org in response pretty much to A State of Fear by, what's the author's name of A State of Fear? Michael Crichton. And it's funded, I believe, by George Soros. So there's a lot of funding on both sides of this. You have activists. The former NASA scientist, James Hansen, got arrested at least half a dozen times protesting global warming. NASA's lead global warming scientist protesting global warming, getting arrested, and he also endorsed a book that suggested we get rid of industrial civilization in order to fight global warming. So this is what we're up against, and I just implore you to open your eyes, read my book, keep an open mind, don't be sucked into this as some kind of there's no dissent, no debate. So with that, I open the floor up to hopefully I get mauled here. Thank you.
Yeah, round of applause. Thank you. So first of all, I would switch to decaf.
So coffee. Maybe you're right.
So wait, so Real Climate is supported by George Soros? I had no idea.
No, I didn't say it's supported. I said it may have been originally set up by funding related to that. And again, I just read that. I don't think I included that in the book, but I just saw where the different sorts of funding. However, the Heinz Foundation has also given people like James Hansen $250,000 as a climate award. At the same time, Seth Bornstein of the AP will get all bent out of shape if someone like Pat Michaels ever received money from industry. When you receive money like Mike Oppenheimer from Barbara Streisand, big Hollywood, big catch up in the case of Heinz Foundation, this is where you have to look at where this money's going, and then all the fossil fuel money going to environmental groups as well. But I'm not 100% on the Soros Real Climate connection. So I did read that, but I have not independently verified, and that's not in my.
It sounds right, so I'm sure it is. Okay, so let me just ask you a question. So we went over some questions a couple classes ago, and because I would have sort of passed the mic around, but we only have 7 minutes, so I do want to get through a bunch of these questions. This got over at 2:40, right? Yeah. Okay, so first of all, let's take a scientific claim like, are humans to blame for the observed warming? So you have a pretty strong opinion that it's not carbon dioxide. And I'm wondering if you could explain how you arrive at that conclusion. Like, what do you?
Okay. In layman's terms, I don't see anything outside from talking to science. Again, as I say in the Merchants of Doubt, a movie, if you want to hate me, go ahead and watch that. I'm not a scientist, but I play one on TV. In fact, I was just on Russia TV today. I was just on what's it called? Turkish TV. I was on Fox last week. So here's the bottom line. I don't see anything outside the bounds of natural variability. The scientists I work with and interview don't. In other words, current temperature, current storminess, current sea levels, current polar bear populations, ice. In fact, it's all well within the bounds of natural climate variability as defined. There's nothing extreme going on. So that's why I don't see where anyone can claim we're outside the bounds and this can only be explained by carbon dioxide.
Right. Yeah, I mean, so someone said you didn't really answer the question. So I mean, just to follow up on that, I mean, if you look, oh, go ahead.
Good. Well, I was just going to say, I don't see anything outside of natural variability of climate. In other words, nothing extremes going on. So why would we have to say carbon dioxide is more than 50% responsible, as the IPCC says? There's no explanation why we would have to. You'd have to go through point by point and say, okay, why is this happening? This has never happened before. Only thing that hasn't happened in recent times is the 400 parts per million of CO2.
Right, okay, but I mean, if you go to the actual attribution chapter of the IPCC report, they never say it's CO2 because we're outside the bounds of natural variability. I mean, are you familiar? If I asked you to explain how the IPCC does the attribution, do you think you could explain to me the IPCC's actual argument?
Yes. What I can explain to you is this, and I documented in my book. When they talk about a confidence level, people like 95% or not, they actually think, oh, well, this is a statistical thing. No, you know what it is? It's a show of hands, Professor Dessler. And I actually have the reports talking. It's a feeling among the scientists in the room. They raise their hands, actually physically, but they actually come up with a feeling of what they have. They don't have an actual statistical basis when they make some of those claims about 95% confident in this, and oh, we've increased it from the last report. And they also use models, and I go into great detail on models. Half the variability in nature isn't accounted for. They actually talk about how they're not actually predictions, they're merely emission scenarios. They don't expect to do terrifically well. So they use the models to say, well, without CO2, we wouldn't have this. And it's kind of like the storms. If storms aren't unusual, who cares if someone comes up with a modeling study and says, Harvey would have been X amount less strong if CO2 were lower? Nonsense, because we've had worse storms than Harvey. There's no trend upward in the big hurricanes. Why do we need to come up with some tortured explanation using climate models, which are a giant fudge factor? So the UN is full of shit on this.
All right, well, so let's go back to attribution, because the students just did that chapter, so they know the IPCC argument. But you didn't really answer the question. I mean, you're right. The expert judgment on the confidence interval is an expert judgment. But the question is, there is an argument in the chapter, the IPCC chapter. They make an argument. They say, here's the evidence. And admittedly, computer models are, 10% of the argument, but there's 90% of the other argument they use. And I mean, I'm wondering, do you know that, or who do you rely on? Like, who do you talk to reach this conclusion?
I think if you read the book, you'll see who I talk to. I mean, I've talked to Dr. Ivar Jever, Dr. Will Happer, Dr. Roy Spencer, John Christie, Richard Lindzen, Judith Curry. These are some of the more active scientists. And then there's a lot of other scientists who are retired, and a lot of other scientists in universities who still follow this. So I have a whole network. And obviously, you can tell who I rely on by reading the book.
Right. Okay. So that you make this is really an interesting point. So the people you talk to are the very few people who will tell you that CO2 is not causing. So you could come up with a completely different conclusion if you talk to different people. So when we were tweet messaging, you said, we were mentioning Jerry North. You said, I like Jerry. So why don't you talk to Jerry North? He would tell you that carbon dioxide is, the dominant driver. So I mean, it seems like you've cherry picked your advisors to give you an answer that you want to get.
Not true, because I follow scientists who used to believe reverse themselves. I include many left-wing scientists. Actually, Freeman Dyson, I've been in contact. Freeman Dyson says that he's basically a Democrat, but thinks the Democrats are completely wrong on this issue. He's considered the successor to Einstein. I interview scientists who used to believe, who then reversed themselves. Absolutely not. I became, working especially in the United States Senate, all these scientists reached out to me. I did the report with 400 dissenting scientists. It eventually grew to over 1,000. So scientists from around the world were emailing me their statements, comments, and then I actually look at all the data. I go through and I follow through what they say, and I look critically at what the United Nations is saying. And some of the more comical people like Michael Mann, who's always fun to watch, and whether it be Gavin Schmidt and others, and you can usually see that their claims aren't holding up, or they're cherry picked. So if there's any cherry picking going on, it's I think I detail in the book, it's like 64, 59 scientists who make up this human attribution, the key sections of the United Nations report, and yet we're told it's the world's top scientists, thousands of scientists, and don't you know they won the Nobel Prize? Yeah, for peace. So Andrew, don't try to talk about cherry picking when you use the studies like that. I mean, if anything, skeptics are the least cherry pickers here. This is a nonsense argument built on a house of sand. The United Nations, for you to promote the UN in any serious way, is insulting to your students.
But okay, so right, but you're saying that you just randomly pick scientists. You came up with Judy Curry and Lindzen and Lord Monckton.
If you read the book, I actually talk about, I was a big believer in the Amazon rainforest about to disappear. I got all involved in that. I actually ended up doing a documentary on it. I started researching. It turns out there's the least endangered forest, 50 acres grow back for every acre cut, and now people are moving from the jungles to the cities. So I came to global warming with a skeptical viewpoint, but I've done massive research. Oppenheimer feature the climate scientists' arguments, and then I analyze them. So it's not like I'm not just presenting one side. If you read a Michael Mann book, he writes cartoon characters the other side. If you read my book, I actually go through and give them in the movie, I think as well, you at least hear the claims, and then we go through and dissent. So absolutely not. I reject.
Well, I mean, I would say that that's, we can argue about whether it's both sides, but I'd say that your arguments about attribution, whether humans are causing the warming, are not correct in a scientific standpoint. I mean, there's a really detailed scientific argument laid out in all the scientific reports that you are unaware of, I think, at least you haven't articulated.
On that exact point, Judith Curry, I think I quoted her, it's recently on my website, she goes through and talks about how they claim certainty where there is none. It's the more than 50% of the warming is due to humankind, and this is where they have this high confidence level on the attribution. So I don't know why, again, where is this coming from that you think this is significant when the Earth isn't even, unless you can say X, Y, Z has never happened before, and the only way this could happen is carbon dioxide. They try to do this with these storms, hurricanes, and it's laughable. I mean, to say, we have lawsuits now saying Hurricane Harvey or ExxonMobil could be X amount responsible for Hurricane Harvey. This is where attribution studies are going. In fact, my website, I have people doing a seance. That's about the scientific equivalent of some of these attribution studies. And you know better, Andrew.
All right, well, unfortunately, I would love to continue. I seriously would love to continue talking, but we're actually 2 minutes over. So let's give Mr. Morano another round of applause. So I really appreciate it. Thank you, and I will. I didn't record the first few minutes. I forgot to hit the record button, but I recorded all the rest, and I'll put this up so everybody can see the exchange, and the students who missed the class can see it. Anyway, thank you, and thank you again, Mark. I really appreciate it.
Well, I'd love some feedback. You have my email. Tell me how full of shit I am. So please let me know if you think that. Thank you. Thanks a lot, Professor. By the way, I really appreciate what you did. Allowing this is rare this day. So you've really done a great thing, Professor Dessler. I appreciate it. Thank you.